Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the podcast. I'm Vickie LeNormand from OutSolve. I have Neil Dickinson here joining me, and today we're going to be talking about compensation and OFCCP.
Specifically, pay for OFCCP compliance reviews. There's been a lot of changes, and enough changes that we think there's really important topics that our clients and audience will be interested in. And Vickie, I know you're dealing with lots of OFCCP compliance reviews right now. On the topic of pay, what are you seeing on the ground level for compensation, and specifically some of the changes that we've seen to the audit letter?
Well, it's definitely throwing some contractors for a loop because now we have to submit 2 years of compensation data. We have to, from the beginning, submit more information. Some of this information we may have seen in previous audits prior to this new scheduling letter. They would have requested some of this, but it was never at the beginning. Now that they have the actual scheduling letter is now 26 items, and 3 of them have to do with, or actually 2 of them have to do with compensation. But within that, and within item number 19, there's an A, a B, a C. There's more sections of what they're expecting from the contractor community right at the submission within those 30 days.
Yeah, it really is quite a difference, especially around the compensation, the scope of the compensation. And I think you're right. It's those 2 years which are really expanding the scope of what the OFCCP can do from what they did traditionally when they were just looking at that one snapshot, or now it's 2 years worth of snapshots that they've got that they're working with, 2 years worth of data. And it really expands the possibilities of what the OFCCP can do. It pretty much doubles the number of the populations, doubles the number of job groups, and from a statistical standpoint, it gives them a lot more opportunities to find issues that they can then follow up on. I know one of the big areas for our clients is making sure that when compiling those required rosters is making sure that the data sets match with the affirmative action plans. Have you seen any best practices for clients in getting those submissions to match what the OFCCP expects?
I really do think that they should start with look at the employee IDs of the individuals who were in the final affirmative action plan, start there, and then pull the data. Because we are finding when they assume, okay, well, who was there as of that point of time or what job title they were in, we're seeing that in the HRISs, and some of them there's some limitations where it's updating to what their current title is, for example, right now, rather than the title that they were in as of that point in time or the salary that they were in as of that point in time. So it is important that they start with the employee ID, so you're sticking with just the employees that are in scope, so the employee count matches, but then really vet it to make sure that when you're going to pull this data, because now you receive the scheduling letter, which could be a year after you pull that data to begin with, especially I know sometimes that this could be later in the year that you get this letter. You could be 10 months into your plan. But so it's important that when you pull it, it is how did that data look as of that point in time and not how it looks today. So I know a couple of clients have had to redo some of their data because they realized that there was some discrepancies or differences from then to now.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing the same thing. We know when the OFCCP gets the submissions, one of the first things they're going to do is basically head counts on what they're seeing in the compensation rosters versus what they're seeing in the affirmative action analysis, with the expectations that those numbers are matching. If they're not matching, you can expect some pretty quick questions around the integrity of the data sets. And I think you're exactly right in terms of making sure that you're starting with those employee IDs of the folks in the affirmative action plan and then pulling in those additional elements that are going to be required. Generally, if your compensation department's running a report separate from your other HRIS tools, they're going to come up with different numbers. So to start with that baseline that they can then append that data to, I agree is a very helpful starting place for getting those rosters in order. So to give everyone an idea of what the OFCCP is doing with this data and kind of the starting point for this, it kind of leads to one of the other changes in the scheduling letter, which is the requirement that you document that an analysis has been performed. So the OFCCP is now requiring that when a federal contractor submits the AAP for audit, that part of that submission is being able to attest that there was an analysis that was performed. On this date, we ran an analysis covering these employees using these statistical techniques. So that expectation is already set that the federal contractor has run some sort of pay equity analysis. Most of our clients are running annual pay equity reports that allow them to have that certification. It's already built in for them. So we definitely see that as a best practice now, is that you have to, and a regulatory requirement, is that you are getting on the front end of running those analyses annually, putting that as part of the processes of what you're doing on an annual compliance basis, to have those reports ready and to be able to attest in times of compliance reviews. Unfortunately, the OFCCP isn't just going to take your word for it when you're able to say that you've run an analysis. They're going to also then take that raw data that we're talking about, those rosters, and run their own analysis. And that's really where it becomes important to be able to tell a good story with your data and also with your compensation documentation. And one of those important elements are what are the data that you have to support your compensation programs. Vickie, do you have some what you've seen in terms of what clients are providing as part of that roster to provide to the OFCCP to help explain where there may be pay gaps?
Yeah, I would say, because what's interesting is, when we're talking to clients, a lot of them may say, oh, well, we're already doing some kind of annual pay equity study. But when I kind of, peel back that onion a little bit and ask them, okay, well, how are you doing it? What factors are being included in this? It's interesting because we may realize, well, maybe it's a global study, or maybe it's only for certain positions, job titles, certain levels or grades that are being included in this study, and it's not everyone. So we need to be careful on, are we really meeting what the government was looking for? When we go to say we've done this review of compensation and here's who we have included, I know some of my clients have made the decision on, while we may have something bigger and broader, maybe we do want to do something that's just narrower, just for these employees that are included in this AAP. And so with that, though, when you do that, you want to say, well, what are the fields, the factors, what drives pay? If we're going to say it's job family, or it is time and job, is it time with company? What are those factors? But whatever we're going to say are those factors, and we're going to actually add that into the database that we're giving the OFCCP, we want to make sure we're running those fields in our analysis to make sure, yes, that's what we're saying is how what drives pay actually is being reflected in that analysis, and it really is telling the story. Because I know sometimes I'll have clients who say, we want to include performance ratings, but when we go to run the performance ratings in there, we've seen, well, actually, there's kind of a disconnect there. We're seeing people who have gotten higher performance ratings, but they didn't get as high of a merit increase as their counterparts. So you just want to make sure that whatever fields that you believe is what's driving pay, we run that in the model to make sure that, yes, that actually is telling the story accurately.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think having an understanding of how the OFCCP is using that data is helpful. So when you're submitting those rosters, the OFCCP is going to be, where they see pay gaps, their expectation, pay gaps for gender or race, their expectation is those additional compensable factors that you provided that Vickie is mentioning, time and position, department. When they build a model and factor in those compensable factors, their expectation is that they would no longer see any statistical significance around gender or race and pay. And that's a really important understanding, in that as a contractor, you have the ability to mirror that as well. So you can run multiple regression analysis, very similar to what the OFCCP does. We have a good understanding of the basic tools that they use and the analysis that they use. So that gives us the ability to not only pull in data that we think tells the right story, but then test that data to make sure that it's not showing any issues beforehand. So it's a really powerful position as a federal contractor to not only know that you've got a comprehensive data set, but you know that if the OFCCP runs it the way that we expect them to, they shouldn't find any issues. And just as importantly, if they don't run it that way, then you've got something that you can go back to and say, time out, sorry, this is how we ran it. We know our data better than anyone, and we're not seeing any issues. So it's a very powerful place as a contractor and a comfortable place to be going into an audit. Keeping in mind that the posture of the OFCCP has definitely changed the past couple of years. One of their big changes is no longer calling the frontline personnel compliance officers, calling them compliance investigators. So they really are looking closely at the data with the idea that they're looking for issues. Not only that, they're also now working with a team. They're working with a team of statisticians that is also taking that data and looking for issues. So we definitely want to be prepared as federal contractors, knowing that that is the type of magnifying glass that is going into our compensation systems, so that we are fully prepared for what they can do statistically, and then also the questions that may follow. So we think it's important to tell a story in the data, tell a story with the statistics that you're running about fair pay at the organization. And then there's also that other opportunity to tell more of a subjective, narrative-based story about your pay systems with that additional pay documentation. Vickie, I'm sure you have some good case studies of clients who've taken advantage of that in terms of providing more information around how their pay systems are consistent and transparent. Have you seen that as well as part of your submissions that you're doing?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of our clients I'm finding that don't actually have a formal compensation policy, but they have more of guidelines. What have they provided to the managers? Was there a range of when setting pay? The compensation team has done their market studies. They know what the midpoint is. Most of the clients I'm hearing, they're saying, yes, if this person has more experience, brings more to the table, they might be above the market, but they're giving these guidelines to the managers. And that's what we've been typically giving as additional documentation for that 19C. Just giving them this is the guidance that we've put out there. This is how we pay our employees. Sometimes it's more like a philosophy, because we're not really seeing that a formal policy, compensation policy, exists majority of the time.
Yeah, I think that's right. Anything that you can do to show that your compensation systems are driven by consistent processes really helps the OFCCP understand what you're doing. And that's always an important point, is remembering that you're dealing with someone who really knows nothing about your organization, may not know a lot about complex compensation systems, certainly in the private sector. So on the front end, they don't know much about you, your data, anything about your compensation policies or systems. So we take the approach that as much information as we can give them that really helps them understand what we're doing, help them understand that it's fair, and help them understand that not only do we have processes that are fair, we're testing those processes and we're giving you the data that's backed up by statistical methodologies to prove that it's fair. Many times what we're doing is trying to head off the OFCCP from thinking that there are issues that aren't really there. And if we just kind of go in blind without any context for a compliance investigator around what's happening with compensation, they may see pay gaps. And if we're not giving them the documentation or data points to understand that there's business reasons for those pay gaps, they may quickly jump to the conclusion that there's something discriminatory happening. Even if there's not, it may lead them to ask lots of questions and extend that audit further than you would want it to go. Also can lead to those compensation interviews that we see quite often, which I think is another place that we can help clients prepare. Anything that you're seeing, Vickie, in terms of the compensation interviews that have become so common now and some of the common questions that we're seeing?
Yeah, I agree. If you can give a little bit more information in the beginning, in the submission, it could help maybe not eliminate having that compensation manager interview, but at least help facilitate it. Because I've been noticing when we have to turn over the other paid allowances, so that is the 12 months prior to the snapshot date, what other earnings could these employees have received? Bonuses, incentives, commissions, shift differentials. You're providing what else is out there besides just base. So when you give that information to them, if you're just giving it on them on this Excel database, this compensation database, if we don't give any kind of explanation or legend around these pay codes or these earning codes, they're going to come back and ask those questions. And some of the information, if we can give it to them in documentation, it's kind of like that joke where it says, here's another meeting that we could have eliminated by just having this email, So I feel like if we could have provided the documentation to them, maybe we could have avoided having this hour-and-a-half phone call with the compensation manager.
Yeah, fully agree. And I think you brought up another point which you haven't touched upon yet, which is the idea of historically, we were oftentimes able to get away with just providing base pay, an annualized salary as part of these submissions, where now it's very clear in the itemized listing that the OFCCP is looking for other forms of pay as well. So it really is a review of total compensation. And you mentioned some of those additional forms of pay, which can be incentive, overtime. It's a much larger list of what the OFCCP is potentially expanding their scope for. So when you add in the additional forms of pay along with 2 years worth of data, again, it's a much larger scope, and really again points to the importance of thinking this through thoroughly and being as prepared as possible as part of that submission.
Right. And I think with that compensation manager interview, if the client is selected to, they invite that they want to have that phone call, they start with a standard list of questions, I'm finding. So you can imagine it's like, well, it opened up a can of worms. If there was something in the data that they either are questioning or not understanding, now they invite that interview, and then they're going to ask the questions on how do you determine what the starting pay will be? How does it work around merit increases? How does that whole annual merit process work? They're going to ask all those questions about the compensation system, about the company. Then toward the end, they may actually get to, well, what was the initial, what stirred up all these, the reason to have this interview? Were there specific questions about our data that they didn't understand the headers or the pay codes, or they're seeing a discrepancy in one title, they're seeing a large gap or a large range between in a certain title. So that's when I find toward the end of the call, when you're getting close to an hour and a half, now they're actually getting to the nuts and bolts of what they wanted to ask. But because we had to have this interview, I feel like it's almost like it's a standard that they have to then kind of just ask all these questions of who's involved in setting pay and how that process works. So again, if whatever we can do to give them as much information, be transparent in the beginning, maybe we could have avoided having to have that interview.
Yeah, they really aren't fun for anyone involved, and the compliance investigators are also required to type all of their questions. So depending on their typing speed, it can be a very long, laborious process of the lag time between answering the question and actually moving on to the next one. We do very often say that it is okay to give yes or no answers in compliance interviews, and you don't have to be too long-winded, because you're going to be reading about it later and hearing them type it as it's as the message is delivered.
Yeah. My advice to that is answer the questions like a 16-year-old teenager. Like, do you know what time it is? Yes, I do. You don't have to say what time it actually is, but do I know what time it is? I do know what time it is. Then if they say, well, what time is it right now? Okay, well, then you can say that answer. But yeah, brief, just answer the question that was asked.
I like that. The same way as a 16-year-old teenager, answered the same way without the scowl, perhaps.
Right.
Well, so what if we were to give, so let's just say we have federal contractors now, they're not on the CSAL, but they know that they could be audited, let's say in the next 6 months or so. In terms of compensation, what would you give as one or two check those boxes now and go ahead and be thinking about these things before that letter comes?
Well, I want to make sure that they are doing the annual pay equity. And like I said, I've had conversations where before this scheduling letter came out, I would ask clients, are you doing some kind of annual review? And their answer would have been, oh yeah, we've got that. But but before we give our annual merit increases, we look at internal equity. And so they were answering the question. So, and I assumed it was satisfactory. But now that we've got this new scheduling letter, we've got the new directive, now I'm just starting to ask that question a little bit deeper. Okay, well, who's involved in that process? How are you reviewing? What kind of analysis are you doing? Are you able to actually type up that item number 22 to certify what you have done? So if they're not currently doing some kind of true analysis of their compensation data. That's what I would say. That's the first thing, is make sure that they do that as part of their annual renewal of their program, to make sure that they are doing it by that AAP location, so it matches the same employees that are in that AAP, and to do it as close as possible to that plan date. There's been a few audits right now that we've got the letter. They weren't doing anything, so we have to run the pay equity now at this point. They want to run something. And so we have to denote on there what date we're doing it. So yeah, we're saying, I know we got the letter, say on August 1, and we're showing that we're doing an analysis on August 15th, to the OFCCP. I would argue, well, we're still doing it. We did it within our plan year. This is our most recent one. But if we could have done it closer to our renewal date, then it just shows that it's a normal part of their program.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point in terms of running analysis that mirrors the affirmative action plan. And as I said, we have a basic understanding of the mechanisms the OFCCP uses to flag compensation data. So we can apply that and do it pretty cost effectively at the plan level. And what that really gives you is that heads up. Hey, this is where we want to look further. And there's a huge benefit. It was really the OFCCP's goal with the directive, was to get companies doing this proactively on their own. They know that they can't audit every federal contractor, so by having contractors look at this themselves is the best way to ensure compliance and move towards fair pay. So the advantage is, when you do it proactively, is you control the narrative. If you find an issue that needs to be corrected, it doesn't have to be because it was discrimination. It can be because we didn't factor in someone's previous experience appropriately. You also control the narrative on how those adjustments come into play. So if you find an issue, you have the ability to correct it, maybe even correct it over time, as long as there's a plan in place to do that. If the OFCCP, EEOC, any federal body finds an issue, it's going to be, you're discriminatory, that's going to be on the press release, and it's going to be back pay plus making someone whole immediately. So from a financial standpoint, from a PR standpoint, you have a great opportunity to do these things proactively and make those corrections on your own, which we think is a big benefit to companies. I would add, in terms of those best practices, fully agree, like doing the analysis at the AAP level is the perfect approach. And then what we're generally finding for our larger organizations, since those regressions analysis, or when the OFCCP really digs in, that's what they're going to be using. For our larger organizations, we start getting up above 300 employees or more, should really be looking at doing those types of regression analysis on an annual basis, so that you can fully mirror those models and have that peace of mind and kind of gold standard best practice around pay equity and measuring pay equity for the organization.
No, I was going to say, a lot of my larger clients are doing that. They're doing the bigger, larger study for the entire organization to cover, because obviously they're not going to pay their employees just by, they don't think about AAP job groups or the AAP location specifically when determining starting pay and compensation. So a lot of them are doing the bigger regression type organization wide, but then also doing so that they don't have to release that information over to the OFCCP, do the non-privileged pay equity. And so this is the one that I can not only hand over to the government to show that I did it, but also this is the one that I have vetted to make sure that I'm including the right fields and columns so I can see what they're going to see before I turn it over. So yeah, I'm noticing that they're doing, two analyses, but for two different reasons. Really
makes sense. You generally find more utility in the regression analysis. And I think it's important too, like we're talking about larger clients, but let's remember we have larger federal contractors. We work with lots of smaller federal contractors as well, 50 employees, 100 employees. Some of these statistics really aren't going to be useful for smaller populations. So we can run higher level statistics to help you, but I think also it's important to keep in mind that many times for those smaller contractors, thinking about the fundamentals of compensation can be more important. Thinking about pay at the job title level, making sure we can defend pay at the job title level. We have a tool called a cohort analysis, which is basically an eyeball test of, in an Excel spreadsheet, there's a difference in pay I can see here because someone's been in the job less time. So those things can be very appropriate for smaller populations. And again, focusing on those fundamentals of, I've got good job descriptions. Maybe I'm to the size where I need to start thinking about using pay structures such as pay grades to really help formalize my process that will help me in audit situations. So understanding that if you're a smaller organization, you might not be jumping into big statistics. You might still be focused on those fundamentals, and setting up good processes around pay are really just as helpful.
Right. So pay ranges for those titles would be helpful.
Those are extremely helpful, and again, not just for federal contractor compliance, but now we also start spreading out. We start talking about pay transparency and what we're seeing in general in terms of the movement towards sharing more information around, especially around starting pay for applicants or transparency for pay ranges. Having that already built in and again standardized instead of kind of flying by the seat of your pants is a huge advantage.
And that's a good point. We've been talking about AAPs and federal contractors, but there are many state laws now that are requiring companies to certify that they are doing some kind of annual equity review. So we know there's a few states have already jumped on with that, and you can expect more to come.
Yeah, what's the list now? So right now we've got California and Illinois. California's every year, Illinois is every other year, and then it looks like Massachusetts is trying to put their toe in the water as well, although we haven't totally figured that one out yet in terms of what their expectation is. Although the expectation is coming up, I think it's February of next year. They're looking for something. We're just not sure what yet.
Correct, that's what I heard.
So yeah, I was just in terms of that other big checklist item that I see and where conversations many times lead, whether it be compliance review situations or organizations just trying to get a handle on good pay practices. A lot of times it's around starting pay. How we're setting starting pay is such an important component. We know from our studies that generally when a pay gap starts, it starts at the time of hire. Most of the time when somebody gets in your system of performance reviews and promotions, that's pretty standardized. But at that time of hire, when we introduce negotiations, geographic differentials, all of those things, that's where we can see those pay gaps really start to spread apart. So it's one of the areas we've been doing a lot of consulting is putting as much process around setting starting pay so that you really get off on the right track. And like I say, that really is helpful when you're doing those in those states that require ranges for starting pay. The other important factor here is when we talk about the expectation that you can explain pay gaps, oftentimes what we see is the most common explanator from a contractor side and employer side is the starting pay was set by someone's prior experience. It's a legitimate business factor and it's very, very common. But then when we ask, can you give us that data for prior experience to help explain that gap, many times that data element is not available. Which can be troublesome. Maybe it's there, but if you've got to go back and dig through applications and resumes to figure that out, that can be a huge burden. So we're seeing more companies that in their HRISs, when they're at that time of hire, also tracking prior experience as one of those fields. Hugely helpful when documenting and explaining fair pay, not only necessarily to auditors, but also when you're doing rationale for internal pay studies, when you're having conversations with employees about where their pay is at. I think that's very helpful. So anything that you can do to build process around starting pay, lots of companies use matrices around prior experience plus education, you're going to fall in this range. That's really hugely beneficial, and then to document those efforts, that pays lots of dividends.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. If there's either way you can integrate it from the application to transfer it over to the HRIS, or I know some of my clients have offered it in the self-service portal of their HRIS system, where the employees, of course you're relying on them to keep it up to date, but they can go in and just as they update any of their information, they could update their current experience, or even as they've working with the company, if they have continued their education, they could update it there. But I agree. How many times have I asked the client, what drives pay? What fields should we be considering? And they immediately say, oh, education and experience. And I say, okay, well, is that digitized? How would I get my hands on that? Oh, no, that would be very burdensome. We'd have to go pull all those applications and read it, figure out the years of experience, and add it to a spreadsheet. So then, okay, well, I don't want to say education and experience necessarily to the OFCCP if we don't have the supporting documentation. So definitely it would be if a company has the ability to figure out what's the best way to get that in there, that would definitely be a best practice.
What do we say in HR compliance every day, Vickie? If you don't document it, it didn't happen. It's the golden rule. That's where we always come back to, and that's one of those key areas. Again, if it's that important to setting pay, it's important enough to document and track. Yeah, really enjoyed the conversation around. We work on a daily basis with clients, looking at pay equity, exploring pay gaps, exploring ways to improve processes around pay so that we can ensure that everyone is paid fairly. It's a pretty, I think, universal concept that we all agree with, and there are some very important tools that we can use to make sure that happens.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're happy to have you. If you have any more questions about OutSolve, Neil, where should they go?
They should go to the OutSolve website, and we've got a really nice updated compensation section on the website. So all of the services that we've been talking about today, I think we'll cover there. And then just as importantly, Vickie and I are very accessible. So if you have specific questions about your organization and pay equity and compensation, feel free to reach out.